in London on my way through. Meeting international community. It must be nice to be It's good, yeah. And I'll be near the British, we meet in the British Library Association headquarters in Bloomsbury, so it's pretty good. I might sit down. Well, we've closed the doors, so it must mean we're going to start. So welcome along tonight, everyone. It's really good to see so many people here. My name's Amelia Mackenzie, and I'm Assistant Director General of the Collections Management Division here in the National Library. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Associate Professor Dr. Ruth Barraclough. As we begin, I will acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, past and present. Tonight's lecture is the last one in an especially vibrant autumn fellowship season. Tonight's topic, Red Glamour, Korea's Early Communist Women, is certainly eye-catching, and with Korea so much in the news at this very moment, you couldn't be in a better place to hear from one of our most accomplished Korea scholars in Dr. Barraclough. Now let me tell you a little bit about her. Ruth's interest in Korea started as a 17-year-old exchange student with periods spent in Korea, and developed through her undergraduate study at the University of Queensland. There were several periods of time spent in Korea at Korean universities where she obtained a certificate in labor studies from Songkong-ho University and Korean language qualifications from Seoul National University, which is a premier institution. She completed her PhD at ANU in 2004 on the labour and literature of Korean factory girls. Postdoctoral study at the University of Sydney followed, and a visiting assistant professorship at the University of Minnesota. Then in 2007, the ANU was lucky enough to get her back as associate professor at the School of Culture, History and Language, where she now teaches modern Korean history, literature and gender studies. Ruth publishes widely and is the author and editor of several enticingly titled scholarly studies, such as Factory Girl Literature, University of California Press, and Red Love Across the Pacific, Palgrave Macmillan. In 2017, just last year, one of Ruth's books, Factory Girl Literature, was translated and published in Korea by Humanitas Press, which is achievement enough, but it went on to spend 19 weeks on the history bestseller list and received numerous recommendations and nominations, which really speaks for itself. As you'll have realized, Ruth is a fluent speaker of Korean and has spent many hours over many years working in the National Library's Korean collection. And I'm personally delighted to know that this gem of a collection, built up over more than 50 years, is supporting such an able and accomplished scholar. Now, before I hand over to Ruth to reveal the secrets of her fellowship quest, my colleagues are very keen for me to tell you that Ruth, like her title, has a glamorous past. In 1986, she was a child actor in the feature film Australian Dream, a prime cut, whatever that means, comedy, starring Noni Hazelhurst and Graham Blundell, which tells the story of a normal, decent Brisbane family where not all is as it seems. Now, I won't give you the plot because I might overexcite you, but really I know because the time, place and people Ruth is going to talk about tonight are much more rewarding. A fascinating group of women in mid-20th century Korea, such a complicated place and time, marked by past Japanese colonial rule and a blossoming of Korean culture. So would you please welcome Ruth?
Thank you very much, Amelia, for that forensic introduction back to my childhood. And I want to begin this presentation by taking you into the Korea collection here at the National Library in Canberra. Nearly 20 years ago, in the late 1990s, I was browsing the stacks as a doctoral student when I discovered a book newly published of biographical sketches of prominent Korean women who had been lost to history. What does this mean? Who was lost to Korean history and why? And what was this process of recovery? This book was one of a whole blossoming of books published in the 1990s that reached back to recover historical figures whose stories had been buried during the period of high anti-communism in South Korea, roughly from the late 1940s to the late 1980s. And in the slide, we have the photo of the National Library itself, and then a photo next to it of my desk, which is full of biographies of leading leftist figures whose stories were being recovered and retold in the 1990s and early 2000s in South Korea. And the crimson volumes you see that come to actual nine volumes of text are a collection that cover the life of just one man, and they are his school records, his speeches, his interrogation records, his correspondence. And his name is Park Hon-young. He was a communist. He was North Korea's first foreign minister, but he would later be purged by Kim Il-sung. So he was lost both to South Korean history over these decades and to North Korean history as well. So men started to re-emerge in full biographies in the 1990s, but women took a little bit longer to surface. And that's because leftist women were submerged under an additional layer of sexual scandal or sexual slander. So who are these women and what happened to them? Well, North Korea stands today as the ultimate pariah state, ruled by a patriarchal communist dynasty. And yet upon its founding in 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, or North Korea, boasted one of the most progressive gender equity laws that the world had yet seen. And not only that, its political officers and state organisations were overseen by some of the most eminent and glamorous women of the Korean Peninsula. So this story that I want to tell you today is really about the downfall of North Korea's early feminist elite. It's an epic tale that spans Northeast Asian history of the 20th century. And the way that I want to tell it is as a feminist history that examines the process by which these women and their stories were buried in both North and South Korea that had no use for them, alerting us that during the Cold War, these two rival enemy states were in full agreement on some things, such as a shared investment in conventional gender ideologies. So if Korea's early communist women were lost to history, then why was this so? How did this happen? Well, we need to go back into history to answer that question. 1945, as Japan surrender was imminent, the question arose of what to do with Japan's former colonies. And the decision was made to slice Korea into two. It was expedient for the two occupying armies that were making their way to the Korean Peninsula. So the Red Army in the Soviet Far East and the American Army that was in the Pacific. The Red Army was the first to reach the Korean Peninsula, And their allies, the United States, panicked, because what if they just kept going through and occupied the entire peninsula? So very quickly, over the space of about 30 minutes, a map was drawn and divided, and it was suggested by the United States Army to the Soviets that they should stop at an area which was at the 38th parallel, cutting Korea roughly in half. And to their surprise, the Soviet Red Army agreed, really because the Red Army by this stage was so exhausted, having fought so long in World War II. So the former colony was divided in half, and there was a joint occupation of the communists in the north, or the Soviet Red Army in the north, and the United States Army in the south. And nobody imagined in 1945 that this would be permanent. In fact, this period of time, from division in 1945 to 1948, when separate regimes began to emerge, is known in Korean history as liberation space, a unique moment or space before the hardening of right and left into a communist state in the north and an anti-communist state in the south, when in the euphoria of liberation from Japanese colonial rule, coalitions were formed across organisations. So the caretaker government that oversaw the dismantling of the Japanese colonial state was a coalition of right and left. Cultural organisations, literary groups, all sorts of state and non-state forums sought to build a newly liberated society by bringing the old anti-colonial forces across the right and the left together. This moment of coalition, this liberation space, was ripped apart by multiple forces. Great power politics, as the occupying governments oversaw entrenchment of their own interests. Political terrorism began to stalk the streets in the late 1940s. There was the beginning of refugee movements as people began to make a choice to remain where they were or to move to a more congenial political space. Land reform in the north happened very early on, 1946, was thoroughgoing, and it was accompanied by sporadic violence. So we saw thousands flee for the south. At the same time, in the south itself, anti-communist massacres began to build. And so a collection of people in this period went north. Who went north? Period from 1945 up until 1950, in the outbreak of Korean War. Well, some of the most eminent figures in politics, in intellectual fields, in culture and the entertainment industries went north in this period. Entertainers, kiseng or courtesans, writers, historians. On the left here we have Choi Seung-hee. Choi Seung-hee was probably the greatest celebrity of the colonial period. She was a dancer. She was also an accomplished singer. She was an actress. She toured in the colonial period in the 1920s and 30s. She toured Europe. She toured the United States. She toured Japan. And she went north in 1946. She set up a dance school in North Korea, and she enjoyed success until her husband's purge in the 1960s. On the right, we have Moon Ye-bong, a film actress, one of the great film actresses of the 20th century in Korea. She was from an acting family. She started her career in the colonial period, so she acted in some propaganda films in the late 1930s, early 1940s, as Korea moved on to a war footing. Moon Ye-bong went north in 1948, and she starred in a series of North Korean classic films. She enjoyed a long career in the north, and she was eventually buried in Pyongyang's Patriotic Martyrs Cemetery, where if you survive in North Korea, that's where you get to be buried. So in the 1940s and 1950s, the fledgling states of South and North Korea competed with each other over who had the greatest artists and which society was the more liberating for women. It's a typical Cold War story. And in this context, the North set up the Women's League in 1945, a mass organisation of over 1 million members, around 20% of the female population of North Korea, and they produced their own magazine, which the National Library here has for us to be able to read. And this Women's League was also involved in key pieces of legislation, which I will be speaking to you about in the moment. So some of these women went north and found success and thrived in North Korea, but many of them would be subjected to North Korean regime's own persecution. And in the south, as anti-communism hardened, they came to be erased from the historical record. So anti-communist culture in the south was constructed out of the complete disavowal of filmmakers, writers, artists, children's book authors, actresses, political figures who had gone north. Their books, their movies, their cultural products were banned. There are some rare figures who became canonical in both South and North Korea, usually because they died before having to make a choice. They died before the Korean War. And in South Korea, the ban on republication of the works of Wolbuk Chakka, or writers who went north, was only lifted in 1988, as the military dictatorship started to be dismantled. So in the 1990s in South Korea, it became this very interesting time of rewriting history, rewriting the canon to include these important figures whose contribution and life story had been erased. So there was this explosion of new books introducing to readers a generation of socialist and communist women that people had grown up knowing nothing about, or rather, to be more accurate, their names had circulated as whispers, as rumours, as horror stories of communism and of the war, and now finally they were being brought out into the open. But there's another layer of complexity to this story, because many of these people who went north were later destroyed in North Korea. While initially welcomed and thriving, eventually they would fall to denunciations, to purges, and some even were executed. So they disappeared from public life in the north as well. And after the Korean War, which was a disaster for the north, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, turned inward and against many of his closest colleagues who he saw as potential rivals. So we have a situation where both North and South buried the stories of these people and their achievements. But these people were peripatetic. They were active in the 1920s and 30s when Korea was part of a larger Japanese empire. Many of them went into exile or travelled between the metropole and the colony. Some of them moved to the Soviet Union, others travelled to America, and still more went to Manchuria and deeper into China. So we find their stories by mapping their education, their exile, their arrest, their interviews, their return to the north. In these circumstances, sources can be very difficult to track down, but they're there, waiting, just waiting for us. So there's a whole number of socialist or communist feminists in Korea. I've only selected 4 of them for the purposes of this talk. And I'm going to go through each of them one by one with you. But just first of all, we have here on the left Vera Chan, or her Korean name Chu Se-juk. Vera Chan was her Soviet name. And she was a peasant who became a Comintern agent. Next to her we have Kang Kyung-ae, who was also a peasant background, and she became a writer. So she's a novelist, poet. And then third from the left, Jung Suk, who was an heiress. She was from a very wealthy family. She became a journalist and later a politician in North Korea. And then finally, on the right, Chung Yeon, who was a kiseng, or a courtesan, and she also became a socialist. So who were these women? And what happened to their program and their organisations and their ideas? Some of them drafted policy and took up positions of power in early North Korean society, only to disappear in the late 1950s or become complicit with the Kim regime. Others did not survive exile in the USSR or they died just before the liberation of Korea in 1945. And their achievements and their stories have been purged from memory in North Korea largely. They've been neglected and left to moulder in Russia, manipulated in South Korea during the period of high anti-communism, and still remain utterly unknown to the wider world. So I'm going to start with Jung Suk, who was from a very prominent and wealthy family in the northern part of Korea, Hamgyong province. And Jung Suk's father was a very well-educated urbane lawyer. He trained at Meiji University in Japan. And he was a nationalist. He was an anti-colonial activist, and he spent the early part of his career in the 1910s and 1920s labouring away in the colonial courts, trying to get nationalists and anti-colonial activists out of prison in the Japanese prison system in colonial Korea. So he got to know everybody across the political spectrum, and he eventually became a communist. His daughter, Jung Suk, was very well educated in Christian schools, and she became a feminist very early on. She was precocious. As a teenager, she participated in the kind of education evangelism that was a very prominent stream of Christian feminism at the time. So she would go out with a number of educated women like herself. She'd go to the provinces and she would meet these gatherings of provincial, lower class, uneducated women, and they'd talk to them about the importance of hygiene and home economics and getting an education, and also that they were worth something, that they were valuable women. So she became an activist for women's rights very early on as a teenager. And then she asked her father to allow her to continue her education and send her to Shanghai. This is around early 1920s, 1921. And Shanghai in this period was known as the Paris of the Orient. It was a very cosmopolitan place. It was a place of culture where people were able to be free thinkers. And so she went to Shanghai. Her father put her on the train to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, she enrolled in language classes, not Chinese language classes, but English language classes. So she was one of this generation that was very internationalist, very much looking out to the wider world. And in Shanghai, she came to meet Korean young people who were there, a whole community of Korean young people who were there. And she joined a socialist reading group, which eventually became a socialist party. She fell in love with one of the young men in this socialist reading group and married him. His name is Im Won-gun. He became a noted socialist. And when he was arrested later on in Korea, she would visit him in prison. And it was very important, if you were arrested, that you had someone outside who would be able to pass through to you winter clothing, food, medicine, to enable you to survive in prison. And Jung Suk and a number of the other Koreans drawn to socialism at this time were very much experimenting with socialism. They were very much themselves feeling through, what does it mean to be a socialist? What does it mean to be a comrade? And they disdained bourgeois marriage. So the second time that her husband was in prison, Jung Suk took a lover. And in doing so, she scandalised colonial Korea. She scandalised communist circles, and even the Comintern in the Soviet Union was informed. Such was the brouhaha. And Jung Suk would later be interviewed about her experiences at this time, and she wrote about what it meant to her to be a comrade. She wrote about love, sexuality, desire, and she also wrote about how difficult it was for women to be socialists, to be left on the outside while the husband and father of one's children was in prison, the isolation and the loneliness. But she was a vilified figure in this period as well. She had a significant mouthpiece. She was a journalist for one of the leading newspapers in the colony. And she wrote her sentences, even today, blaze off the page. She had an extraordinarily powerful voice, and she had the backing of her father all throughout this as well. And she wrote things like that women must learn to claim for themselves their own freedoms. And eventually, into the 1930s, as political activity became more and more difficult in the colony of Korea, she moved to China with a man called Tae Jang-ik, who she later married. And in 1945, she's invited back to Korea. She's invited back to the north. And she becomes a member of this very important group here on the slide, which was really the key committee that was working to establish the North Korean state. So I think you can see her on the front row, second from the right, and there's Kim Il-sung in the centre. So she became, in North Korea's first cabinet, a cabinet minister. She was Minister of Culture from 1948 to 1957. She was Minister for Justice from 1957 to 1959. And she was Minister for Justice during the purges in North Korea, the purges following the Korean War, which I'll say a little bit about in a moment. And she's believed to be not only complicit in the purges, but to have denounced a former lover in the purges. So in South Korea, her name circulated as someone who kind of embodied the pathologies of communism, both in her sexuality and in the way in which she was ruthless in her application of politics. Her sister, during the Korean War, went south and was in hiding for 9 years because of the taint of having communist family in the north. But Jung Suk and some of the other women that we'll see in a moment was one of the founders of an extraordinary organisation in 1924 called Tonghuhae, or Society of Comrades. And it was an organisation whose manifesto was published in the pages of the daily newspaper, and it was an organisation explicitly for 여성 무산자, so women without property. So explicitly for women without property. And it took advantage of the institutionalised sex segregation at the time, and it went into the girls' schools. They went into the female-dominated factories, and they helped organise. They organised some of the leading girls' high school strikes of the period. They helped fund strikes and agitate for better conditions, and did many other things as well. So that's Jung Suk. Another prominent early communist woman is the writer Kang Yeon. We don't have many pictures of Kang Yeon. She was a daughter of a very poor family. Her father died when she was young. Her parents were peasants. She was educated in missionary schools. She's from the northern part of Korea. And she becomes a writer. She moves to Manchuria in 1931. And she never joins the party, but she writes about the communist guerrillas, the partisans, who in the 1930s were active on the borderland between the northern region of Korea and China, so the kind of purple and orange line there. Kang Yeon wrote about the anti-colonial communist partisans on this border region, and Kim Il-sung was one of these partisans as well, as it turned out. So what sort of feminist was she? Well, Kang Yeon wrote a book that has since become a factory girl classic in Korea. It's called 인간 문제, or it's been translated into English just recently, and it's called From Wonso Pond. And before she moved to Manchuria, she needed to go into the factories to make money to pay for her passage to Manchuria. So she worked in these female-dominated textile factories in Incheon. And her book became a book about factory girl life. And she wrote about sexual violence in the factories, not as a simple tale of evil Japanese managers and innocent Korean factory girls. She gave us something far more realistic and devastating. She wrote about the wage system in the colonial factory economy. And the wage system was not a stable wage. It was a wage that relied on multiple bonuses and favouritism to pump it up into a living wage. And what this meant was that women working in the factory were forced to be complicit with a culture of sexual violence. They were forced to be complicit, in a sense, with their own harassment. And she wrote of her characters learning this at great damage to themselves, and yet also perceiving the larger politics and using this knowledge to speak to all of the girls in the factory and to take charge of their own hard-earned emancipation. So we can see why this book became a kind of factory girl classic. So Chung Yeon died in 1944. She died before the liberation of Korea from Japanese colonial rule, but her husband was a communist. And he went north, 1945, 1946, and he arranged for the republication of her novels and short stories in North Korea, where they became classic canonical texts. Not only that, but they also were translated and circulated around the communist bloc during the Cold War. So they were translated into Russian, into Chinese, into Spanish, into German. Today in South and North Korea, in both South and North Korea, she's considered a canonical writer. So she's one of the great early modern authors of Korea. So the third woman I want to talk to you about is Vera Chan. So Vera Chan is her Soviet name, her Russian name. And Vera Chan was also a peasant daughter. And a very interesting thing was happening with the missionary schools and the daughters of peasants in early 20th century Korea. Because when missionaries arrived in Korea in the early 20th century, they came from Canada, they came from the United States, they came from Australia, and women missionaries came particularly with the purpose to educate women in Korea, to free them from what they saw as their backward status, and to teach them a kind of Christian liberal liberation, female liberation. And when they established their schools, their missionary schools, it turned out that aristocratic women and bourgeois women wanted very little to do with them, because they didn't like the idea of their daughter sitting next to the daughter of a concubine or their own maidservant from their own household, God forbid. So it was peasant girls who became one of the largest body of students in these missionary schools. And what we see in the 1920s as a whole new generation of kind of peasant women intellectuals who are products of these missionary schools, and Vera Chan is one of these as well. So she was arrested in 1919 for anti-colonial activity. She was involved in a mass demonstration. She spent a month in prison. And when she got out, she also wished to move to Shanghai to experience life on a larger scale. So she got a job as a nurse in a Canadian missionary hospital, and she earned her passage out to Shanghai. She moved to Shanghai in 1921, and again she met the Korean community in Shanghai, and she was recruited to socialism by her friend Jung Suk, who had arrived in Shanghai a little bit earlier. And when Vera returned to Korea, she also became one of the co-founders of this organisation, the Society of Comrades of 1924, this socialist feminist organisation. And she became a union organiser in the textile factories, female-dominated textile factories. And she married this man, Park Hon-young, and they had a daughter together, Viviana. Park Hon-young was a socialist. He was imprisoned, and he suffered a great deal with his imprisonment. So when he was released, they decided to move to the Soviet Union. So in the late 1920s, they moved to Moscow, and they attend university together in Moscow. They attend KUTV, the Communist University for the Toilers of the Far East. And in the early 1930s, they're sent on a Comintern mission together to Shanghai. So they place their daughter, here she is, Viviana, they place her in a children's home. There were no orphanages in the Soviet Union. They place her in a children's home, Yetidong, and they travel to Shanghai on their mission. And in Shanghai, it's disaster. Park On-young is arrested. Vera hears that he's died in prison. So she remarries their mutual friend and goes back to Moscow. She remarries a man called Kim Dan-ya, and they move back to Moscow. And they settle into kind of everyday, ordinary life in Moscow until the late 1930s and Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 to 1939. So Vera's second husband is a Korean, Kim Dan-ya, and he's actually a member of the Bolshevik Party. So he's one of the few Koreans who was able to gain membership of the Bolshevik Party. And he thought that this would provide some stability and some protection. But of course, as we know, in Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 to 1939, it was communist intellectuals who were targeted. So he's arrested. He's convicted of the crime of being an enemy of the people, and he's executed, likely almost immediately, in the basement of Lubyanka in central Moscow. And Vera is arrested. She's accused of being a wife of an enemy of the people, and she's sent into exile. She's sent to Gulag in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic for 5 years. So there she is. She's in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. After 5 years, she's allowed out of Gulag, but she's not allowed to return to Moscow to live with her daughter, who continues to be in the children's home. So she gets a job in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. She's like a factory worker. And then the years pass, early 1940s, become 1945, 1946. She picks up an old copy of Pravda, and she finds out that the communists, her old comrades, have come to power in North Korea, and prominent amongst them is her first husband, whom she had believed dead, now head of the Workers' Party in South Korea. And finally, Chung Yeon, who tells a different story of what it was to join the socialists in this period. So Chung Yeon was what's called a kiseng, and it's hard to translate this term, something like courtesan, or sometimes people say it's like a geisha in Japan, but it's quite different as well. It's a much older profession. It's a profession that kind of joins the pre-modern with the modern. So it's a very old profession from pre-modern Korea. But it also was reinvigorated during the colonial period because there were lots of connoisseurs of kiseng amongst the Japanese colonial elite as well. So Chung Yeon and the feminist scholar Tonti Song tells us that Chung Yeon was sold to a kiseng house when she was 8, and she debuted when she was 11. She was a kiseng at one of the most fabulous kiseng houses in Seoul, one of the fanciest, one of the most glamorous. And Chung Yeon was very critical of the kiseng profession. She saw herself as a sex worker with much in common with other working people. And she also became one of the founders of the Society of Comrades from 1924, this organisation. So Chung Yeon joined the Society of Comrades, and she joined the Communist Party only later, but she became one of the most outspoken critics of what she saw as kind of male-dominated culture of the Communist Party. She argued for a separate left feminism before leaving politics altogether following the increasing political crackdowns of the 1930s in colonial Korea as Japan moved on to a war footing. After division, she restarted her organisational work. So during the intervening years, from the mid-1930s to 1945, she opened a sewing shop in Nagwon-dong, which is a little suburb in Seoul, because she needed to make a living and she had no desire to go back to kiseng work. So she kind of buried herself in ordinary, everyday life. In 1945, she restarted her organisational work in this moment of liberation space. She took up a leading role in the Women's League, which had branches in the South as well. And as coalition and leftist politics became increasingly untenable in the South, she went north in 1948, where she also took up leading positions in the Women's League. And after the Korean War, the record goes quiet. We don't know if she died, we don't know if she was purged. So feminism in colonial Korea, what was their feminism? I think people are we're much more familiar with the term socialist feminism. Communist feminism is much harsher to our ears. It's much more unusual to our ears. And in the late 1910s, early 1920s, the first Korean socialist organisations began to emerge in the Soviet Far East, in China, as we know, in Shanghai, in the colony itself, in Korea, and in Japan. And it emerged under many names: Socialist Party, Revolutionary Party, youth organisations, peasant organisations. But from 1928, when the Comintern announced its directive of one country, one party, we saw a concentration on establishing one viable, unified party within the colony. And so to be socialist, or to be a variation on this, or to be experimental, was to be factional, was to be a problem at this time. And so the language of feminism also began to shift. As communism grew, feminism diminished. And what was their feminism? For some women, as I mentioned, it grew out of this kind of Christian stream of women's liberation. For other women, it emerged from their own experience of economic exploitation and sexual harassment in the colonial economy. Their high point was really the establishment of this organisation, Society of Comrades, for women only, in 1924. And after 1928 and the Comintern's announcement of one party, one country, and the hardening into one communist organisation, some of the most important and interesting socialist feminists grew distant from after this time. Chung Yeon, the Kiseng, grew distant. Chung Yeon, the writer who lived in Manchuria, made the decision to never join the party. She was an autonomous leftist sympathiser. So there's just a map, I won't linger here, of where they were in the late 1944, 1945, as Korea is liberated. Vera Chan is in the Kazakh Republic. Jung Suk is in China. Chung Yeon has just passed away. And Tonti Song is in her little sewing shop in Seoul. So they're scattered over Northeast Asia. So what sort of society did North Korea wish to create when liberation came and it had its opportunity? Where do we find the red feminists in North Korea? And I suggest we take a look at some of the earliest legislation that was passed very quickly in North Korea. One of them is the Labour Law. The Labour Law was instituted on the 24th of June 1946, and it's important to remember that the Labour Law resonated on a number of different levels. So when Korea was a colony of Japan, and Korea was a colony of Japan from 1910 to 1945, Japan was unique amongst colonial powers, different to Spain and to England and to France and to Germany, in that Japan actually industrialised its colony. Japan industrialised Korea in this period for its own purposes. Nonetheless, the infrastructure was laid. And as Japan moved on to a total war footing from 1937, when it invaded continental China, Korea and Manchuria became the kind of industrial hinterland supporting the Japanese Empire's war efforts. So the textile factories, the food factories, the heavy industry factories were hugely important there. But there was no labour law. Japan had a labour law in Japan proper, but it didn't apply in the colonies. So factories were sites of potential extreme exploitation in Korea throughout this period. So when the North instituted its labour law, June 1946, we can see 8-hour day, paid vacation, paid maternity leave, health insurance, breastfeeding allowances in the workplace. And just a month later, they instituted the gender equity law. And here we see women have the right to vote and stand for election, and they did, and they were elected. Equal wages with men, free to choose a marriage partner, free to divorce, marriageable age lifted to 17, equal property rights in inheritance in families. Sex work is outlawed. Polygamy and concubinage system, remnants of the old feudal past, are outlawed. And it's worth pointing out that progressive as they were, And this gender equity law was one of the most progressive gender equity laws in the world in 1946. Progressive as they were, there is some distance between these articles of state feminism and the feminism of the 1920s and 30s. Many of these laws focus upon supporting women as mothers because their most important job would become supporting the patriarchy in North Korea. So the gender equity law, world leading in 1946, was a kind of remnant or a shadow of this earlier feminist push, this heyday of the 1920s, when these communist women, these socialist women, addressed what was the first generation of factory workers and nurses, and they also included sex workers and concubines and maidservants and students and the unemployed. And they helped build unions. They helped fund strikes. They organised international strike tours to fund strikes in some instances. They advised student leaders in the girls' high schools. They called out sexual violence in the colony in the 1920s. And for themselves, they searched for what it meant to be, to claim their own sexuality, to be modern, to be socialist, and to claim their own sexual pleasure as well. So only shadows of this remain in the 1946 legislation of these earlier struggles from the 1920s. So I'm conscious I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move to conclude. So I just want to say a word about the Korean War, a few words on the Korean War, which really cemented the decline of the early communist women in North Korea. The Korean War was a disaster for both sides. After 3 years of fighting and millions dead, the result of the Korean War was merely that the status quo was reinstated. Nothing had been achieved. The dividing line at the 30th parallel merely remained with some slight variation. So Kim Il-sung's invasion of the South in June 1950 did not bring the glory of reunification he'd promised his allies, China and the Soviet Union. In fact, Mao Zedong's son died in the Korean War. And in the disastrous aftermath, North Korea's leader turned inward to his own political circle to purge criticism of his leadership. So what happened to the feminist wave after the Korean War? Many were purged, and the only communist feminists who survived ended up being complicit with the regime in its turn toward patriarchal state communism. And sometimes even this complicity was not enough to avoid purge. Their burial appeared to be complete. But recently in South Korea, from the 1990s building up to the 2000s until today, we are in a moment of extraordinary revival of interest in these women. These are just a selection of books about them published in the last couple of years, including these 2 books on the left, which are called 세 여자, 3 women, about 3 of the communist women, and which became a bestseller in the fiction lists in South Korea last year. These women have also been incorporated into the recent Me Too movement, which is sweeping the world, and South Korea is no exception, because it was the early socialist and communist women who were some of the first to speak out about sexual violence and sexual harassment that women were experiencing. So what we're seeing in South Korea today is the reincorporation of these women into a kind of feminist genealogy. They're studied for their insights and for their criticisms, many of which remain relevant and timely today. But it's taken much longer for them to surface in English publications. And I've just got a selection here of very, very recent translations into English. Some of these books are by Koreans who went north in the 1940s. So Lee Tae-jun is a male writer who went north in the 1940s, and he was purged in the north. His work is finally being translated into English. But From Wonso Pond is the translation into English of Kang Young-hae's Factory Girl classic, published by the Feminist Press 2009. So we have Columbia University Press, Cornell, at last we're able to enjoy a richer account of Korea's 20th century. So I want to end by restating, going back to the beginning, I guess, and restating the importance of libraries and archives around the world that are treasure troves of material on early North Korean society and the feminists of the 1920s and 30s. And I want to take a note of where sources can be found. So we have the Library of Congress, which holds women's magazines from the late 1940s and early 1950s, North Korean women's magazines, and some of these women write for these women's magazines, and they're sitting in the Library of Congress because they were captured during the Korean War. So they're extraordinary documents there. In the centre we have Rgaspi, so it's the Russian State Archives of Political and Social History. It also contains the Comintern archives. So whenever Koreans entered the Soviet Union or entered an institution like a university, they were required to give an autobiography. So there's multiple autobiographies of Korean communists who were present in various institutions in the Soviet Union. Also their university records, any Comintern mission reports, if they went on Comintern missions, applications to join the Bolshevik Party are there as well, and appraisals of them. How loyal are they? How reliable are they? And etc. I don't have a photo of another key archive, but I just want to mention it, and that is the FSB archives, so formerly KGB archives, but for our purposes NKVD archives, where there are a bunch of wonderful archivists who are looking over very important sources for us of arrest and interrogation records from the 1930s and 1940s. So they're all there as well. And the National Library of Australia, which carries issues of this women's magazine called Choson Yosong, or Women of Korea's North Korean women's magazine, that has been going from, my collection is from 1949 up until the present day, probably a little bit earlier. And the National Library of Australia has these women's magazines from the 1960s and 1970s, and that tells us something very interesting about both North Korea's own diplomatic efforts to reach out to the wider world in this period, in the 1960s and 1970s, but also, especially in the 1970s, Australia's own shift to cultivate diplomatic relations with communist East Asia in this period as well. So there's many more libraries and archives that can be added. The National Assembly Library in Seoul, private libraries in Korea, which also hold fascinating material, the National Archives in Daejeon, Russian State Library in Moscow, and the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. So I want to end by acknowledging the vital work over decades of librarians and archivists who dwell amongst this material and know, often better than anyone, the rich sources waiting for anyone curious enough to come searching. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, so much for your presentation and for explaining to us so eloquently the stories and the real lives and motivations of those four amazing women, and connecting it so compellingly to the present day. And your concluding words, of course, very meaningful to us and very flattering. Now, we have time for some questions, I think. We'll maybe take 10 minutes or so. So we don't need microphones, and feel free to raise your hand and let me know that you'd like to speak, and we'll start with the front row.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I studied the origins of the Korean War, it was 30 years ago, so much of that flooded back. The one thing which I thought, and I thought the talk was fantastic, I don't think that I'm being critical of you, but the one thing which struck me when I was reading Bruce Cummings and other women back then was just how after Japan was defeated, there was an incredible sort of renaissance of democracy and egalitarianism and co-ops right through Korea, and quite a lot of sort of philosophical, ideological uniformity. And then, the great tragedy was the the Soviets occupied the North, the Americans the South, and they just ripped that apart, just totally polarised that situation on the peninsula. But I think in terms of I just wonder though about the links between those gender equity type laws and labour laws and that sort of renaissance of egalitarianism and equality which emerged immediately after the Japanese surrendered.
That's a very good comment. I'm just going to ruminate on that. I don't have a neat answer for you. But indeed, yes, I guess I often look for the earlier incarnations of that. But you're right, it was a time when all sorts of people were returning back. So some people walked, made their way. They were deep in continental China, and they walked back to the Korean peninsula. But yes, all of that was present, indeed. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I was trying to imagine how hard it must have been for these women, and it obviously wasn't easy. But in terms of contemporary equivalents, the Society of Comrades, for example, was that a handful of people? Was it an underground organisation? Was it secret? Was there a handful, or were there thousands of members, or what?
So there weren't thousands of members, but it wasn't secret. Its manifesto was published in the major daily newspaper in Korea, but its activities, so the daily press was also interesting. So the daily press in the colony was Korean, and it was very nationalist. So strikes were very well covered, industrial disputes, anti-colonial activity in the courts was very well covered in these newspapers. Censorship became an increasing problem in the 1930s, but the 1920s is this extraordinary kind of moment of all sorts of political, philosophical, cultural activity is allowed to flourish in the colony. And there's all sorts of reasons for that I won't go into at this point, but in terms of the reach of the Society of Comrades. So it was a small collection of people who founded it, but they then went into the high schools, middle schools, factories all over the colony. And what we find is that when we hear of a secret girls, anti-colonial organisation that's been cracked, we find, Jung Suk was the advisor for that organisation. Or, there's a strike tour and they're going to Japan. Vera Chan was someone who helped organise that. So they, under very, as you say, very difficult circumstances, they themselves reached out to these kind of sex-segregated, female-only organisations to do what they could to build, not only to help these young girls and women in the everyday, but also try to build organisationally as well.
So would you liken it to the suffragette movement in Britain, where small beginnings and it slowly spread as a network?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the suffragettes are so interesting as well, also in how they peeled off into support for World War I, and very nationalist, and then there were the dissident kind of socialist suffragettes who had nothing to do with that. So I guess in the same way you can say there was quite a tangled history or complicated history here as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
We were talking before about the introduction of communist literature into Korea from the West, from Germany in particular, and we mentioned Rosa Luxemburg. Now, Rosa Luxemburg must have been, I imagine, a considerable intellectual force among women from what you just said. So what can you tell us about her?
Yeah,
her understanding of liberation of the working class from slave labour, from wage slavery.
The answer is that I wish that Rosa Luxemburg and her writings had been able to reach a greater audience in colonial Korea. There were women who, from the communist movement in Germany or the socialist movement in Europe, who had a great influence on the whole socialist movement in Korea. So Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai was extremely popular, but Rosa Luxemburg did not attain the kind of influence that you imagine she would have resonated with these women. And I guess when we think about networks of translation in this period in the 1920s and 1930s, so it's works coming out of the movement in Europe, often going first to Japan and translated into Japanese, and then often retranslated into Korean. And there's all sorts of layers of both reinterpretation and internal censorship that mean that some writers are picked up more than others. The question of Rosa Luxemburg is a fascinating one, and I do need to go more into look at that. She became rehabilitated and much more influential, interestingly enough, in the South Korean student movement in the 1980s. So we see Rosa Luxemburg reappear in Korea in this period, in the 1980s and 1990s. And I don't know if you know the recent fabulous graphic novel of Rosa Luxemburg, Red Rosa, published by Verso, translated almost immediately into Korean in 2016. So the question of whose work travelled, whose work was translated, whose work was able to reach a larger audience is a very interesting and complicated one. And unfortunately for Rosa Luxemburg, her influence came much later. And for us, yeah.
I'll just supplement that question with a question about Bernstein, evolutionary socialism, the father of social democracy, intellectual father of social democracy. He must have also, I imagine, been translated.
That I don't know. I'd need to check for you. Yeah.
Bernstein, very important.
Okay.
For social democracy. Well, he did.
Yes, right at the back.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned in the 90s and 2000s there started to be that greater interest in these sorts of women. Was that something that came more from the academia in Korea having more freedom, or was it perhaps more encouraged by the government to show that they were opening up?
That's a really interesting question. And the answer is initially academics. And some of these women were recovered by South Korean feminist historians, but some of them were actually very difficult to recover, even for South Korean feminist historians. And one of those is Jung Suk, who became the minister during the purges. So she continued to be a troubling figure in South Korea for feminist historians for a very long time. And I would say that now the interest in these women has crossed over, has well and truly crossed over from an academic audience to a more general audience. And what I perceive is that that's partly thanks to a new younger generation of feminists in South Korea, women and men, who are very interested in looking back and creating this kind of feminist genealogy, looking back to their roots. So we see that these books, so I had a whole bunch of academic books, but actually last year there was a novel that became a bestseller about these women. So we've seen this shift, I think, into more general readership, which is great. Yeah.
Yes.
Forgive me for asking a really silly question, but why Vera Chan? Why did
Yes.
you change her name?
Thank you. Yes, other people. She had many names. So when she first arrived in the Soviet Union, she took the name Koreba, which is the Russian version of Korean woman. But eventually she settled on Vera Chan. And actually, so this Khan, Khan, is interesting because it doesn't sound Korean at all. But in fact, a number of Soviet Koreans, so that is Koreans who went to and stayed in the Soviet Union, when they Russianized their names, a number of them took Khan. And I don't know why. I've asked linguistic historians. So she took this name, and I guess it shows us that she took her immigrant name. She took the name that she hoped create for herself a life that would be legible to other people as she lived in a working class suburb in Moscow, and she had a kind of ordinary lower middle class job when she lived the normal life before events overtook her. And this name is kind of, I guess, an example of what many migrants do to kind of change their name to try to create a space for themselves in this new society. So that's the best I can do, I'm afraid. Yeah.
We might have to call a halt there, but that was a really, really interesting discussion, so thank you everyone for your questions. There's more cheese and wine outside, so feel free to move out there and finish it off once we leave. But I will just say a few words before I ask you to thank Ruth one more time. Korea has our attention at the moment, but the state of the Australian economy is really out of the news. So I do recommend you come along to the first lecture of our winter season on Wednesday the 20th of June, when Professor David Vines will speak about the fascinating genesis of Australian macroeconomic theory. One to look out for. So until then, please join me in thanking Ruth.
We're muted now, so we can say what we like.
Thank you, Ruth. It was a fantastic talk. I think what I made is pretty valid, but at the same time, I mean, how do you sort of make those connections go?
Thank you for starting us off.
You read where it was coming, aren't you?
Yes. Amazing book you wrote.
It was, and I was doing my honours year in Korean history under the government comic.
Was that so?
Yeah, just as it came out. So I actually went to the United States that year at the end of the year, both volumes cost a fortune.
Really? In those
It's a
days,
fortune.
yeah.
Wow.